Welcome back to the second panel. There's a slight change to the running order. We're starting this panel with a presentation from Angela Gendron from Carleton University, and then that will be followed by Dr. Anne Alley from Curtin University, and then thirdly Dr. Maura Conway from Dublin City University. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Angela.
Good morning, everyone. Nice to be here. My PowerPoint here is very basic, but I thought it might just give a little bit of structure as I go on. I think we all agree that since 9/11, but more particularly since the July 2005 attacks, that the terrorist threat in the West has been perceived as coming from within, from young people living in Europe and North America who are inspired, radicalised and drawn into terrorism by ideologues, radical preachers, jihadist clerics, etc. And they're espousing Al-Qaeda's revolutionary and violent interpretation of Islam, either in person or in their online presence and the materials they provide. So we've got a homegrown threat, which is a particular concern because it is analogous to a sort of fifth column of long-term residents who repudiate the values of the society in which they are embedded. So this is the problem in terms of radicalisation. I was interested in that quote, the ideological pipeline, which is what we're really talking about. This was said in terms of counter-terrorism and dealing with homegrown terrorism in Britain, but Pantucci, whom I'm sure you've heard of, he said, well, it's far more important to break that pipeline than it is, it's as important as it is to stop terrorists coming into the UK, but a far more difficult thing to do. So the need to understand the radicalisation phenomenon, when, why and how people living in a democracy become radicalised and susceptible to militant Islamism, has been at the centre of academic and public debate for some years. And it has generated a number of primary data research studies, but we're still not yet in a position to determine why structural or individual level drivers lead to the radicalisation of some individuals, but not to others. So I want to start briefly with what we know about the radicalisation process in terms of the various research approaches that have been used. So these are the three. I'm particularly indebted to a paper by Anja Dalgaard, a Danish researcher, who did a summary of this back in 2010. The sociologists contend that overall structural factors such as globalisation and the weakening of traditional communities are developments that have led to questions about identity in young Muslims. For example, Keppel, Roy and Khosrokava suggest that the search for identity can explain why even Muslims who are well educated, from affluent backgrounds, seemingly well integrated in our society, nevertheless may resort to violence. Why is that so? They don't explore in any depth why it is that only a minority of Muslims exposed to the same structural influences don't become radicalised. But Roy talks about factors such as travel and lifestyle, which may differ, and Keppel, he actually refers to the influence of radical preachers. Moving on to social movement theory and network theory, we're talking about scholars such as Viktorovitz in the first and Mark Sageman in the second. They've contributed empirically based research which is theoretically informed. And they've looked at the specifics of recruitment and radicalisation processes in Europe. And their findings influence, as you probably know, bonds of friendship or kinship as broader social networks and transmitters of radical ideas. And Sageman, of course, it's his bunch of boys. It's who you know as much as anything else that leads to radicalisation. And then we move on to the last one, the empiricist case study. Driven approach focuses on individual motivations. And despite a deficiency of solid empirical data, research of this type has highlighted a diversity of drivers and triggers. A Dutch study that I refer to by Poot and Sonnenschein, think I've said that right, while it admits to methodological constraints and a lot of overlap, nevertheless identifies 4 categories of activists within radical groups. And they're differentiated in that study according to particular circumstances and motivations, but essentially it's illegal foreigners, I think I've got them next, illegal foreigners, active and or reformed criminals and addicts, seekers, and idealists and political activists. There was a mention earlier on about foreign fighters. I would think foreign fighters really come into those 2 middle categories. And so in that sense, when we're talking about their qualifications, their level of education, their motivations, they're very particular. Foreign fighters often are not those who want to commit jihad at home, wherever their home is. So these different research approaches being used to explain the process of radicalisation should be seen as complementary rather than competing. They focus on different levels of analysis and different aspects of the phenomena. Many identify factors which reinforce rather than contradict each other, but in some, and unsurprisingly, the social and environmental factors render some individuals, a range of social, psychological and environmental factors render some individuals more susceptible to militants than others, which doesn't really take us very far. We're still out there on the search. So for my purposes, it's that last category, the idealists and political activists, which is particularly relevant to radical preachers, jihadist clerics and so on, whether you talk about that in person, a direct influence, or whether it's an online presence. Why? Because the Dutch study identified that it is these people who are overwhelmingly motivated by social and external factors, not the internal to the individual, their vulnerabilities, their psychological hang-ups, their insecurity needs, etc. It's the economic, political, cultural, etc. that motivates them, and they get very angry about it. They look around the world, they see Muslims whom, in their perception, are oppressed, and they're asking why and what needs to be done. But even more interesting, well, let me just first say, in the post-9/11 environment, as we know, because counter-terrorism measures have been effective, we're now into bottom-up recruitment rather than top-down recruitment. And so the leaders of these cells of terrorists, who are usually led by that last category, the idealist and political activists, they have a lot of influence, certainly in terms of recruitment, but in terms of radicalisation as well. It's they who are the driving force in the cells. So we have to say what's motivating them. I've said it's social and external factors. But the study goes on to say that the idealists did not become radicalised because of personal experiences, as Sageman suggested, but because they were responding to perceptions. The perceptions derived from television images, videos, audio tapes, websites, online sermons, and the stories of others. Sort of the narrative is coming here. And so based on, if you like, second-hand information, they are angry and they are justifying a violent response to what they perceive to be the problem. So moving on to the charismatic leader then, my shorthand for the jihadist clerics and all the rest of them, the self-styled imams and so on. Thomas Precht in 2007 very clearly identified as a trigger factor the presence of a charismatic leader or spiritual advisor. Certainly the Quilliam Foundation too, in a study in 2010, also identified a charismatic leader as very important. The Quilliam Foundation focused on the importance to the cell leader of a charismatic cleric, imam or whatever. So the two are saying the same things, but what we need to do is look at this a little bit further. I guess all 3 studies allow space for the role of the charismatic leader. And it can be an international jihadist, like Anwar al-Awlaki that Martin mentioned, who operates at the international level, both personally and online. It could be a local self-styled imam who leads discussions in fringe group meetings locally, and only the select few Muslims are invited to those meetings, i.e. the ones that look as if they're committed and can go on to become more radicalised, or radicalised at all, I mean, you know. Or it could be, which one didn't I mention? The imam. The cell group leader, of course. So all three studies allow that a charismatic leader is important. It could be at the international level, a local preacher, or the cell group leader, him or herself, but it's been himself so far. So my interest in the role of jihadist clerics started with a research study I did back in 2007 for the Canadian Integrated Threat Assessment Centre. And I looked at al-Qaeda propaganda and the role of preachers. And more recently with Martin, we were asked to do a study of a group of 3 Canadians who had been radicalised and went abroad to fight. Concern, of course, then was they might come back and do something at home. And it seemed that those 3 had very largely been radicalised by online materials, particularly the materials provided by Anwar Awlaki. I'll say a bit more about him later on, but as Martin's already said, he produced a lecture series, Constants on the Path of Jihad, and he has an internet guide, 44 Ways to Support Jihad. And together these 2 are among the most frequently downloaded materials on jihadist websites and so on. And we actually spent 5 hours listening to Awlaki's 44 Ways, and we almost became converted ourselves, didn't we? Oh, the Constants, okay. It was the Constants we listened to. But, I mean, it was very, very powerful indeed. So, like the majority of those radicalised and drawn into Islamist terrorism, these 3 young men were part of a leaderless jihad, as it's come to be known. Largely self-radicalised, self-activated before, if ever, contacting operatives of al-Qaeda or other affiliated groups. They eventually left North America and they haven't returned since. We don't know what's happened to them. In the West, potential activists and peer group leaders are identified and targeted by radical preachers or jihadist clerics in order to awaken them to al-Qaeda's worldview and convince them of the necessity and justification for militant jihadism. Viktorovitz and other social movement scholars call this process of achieving congruence between the individual interests and the organisation interests as frame alignment. I think somebody's mentioned that framing term earlier today. Now, individuals come under that Salafist jihadist umbrella for a number of different reasons, and it is possible for those preachers to tap into existing sentiments and take advantage of them. By that I mean they're angry perhaps at having not been promoted at work or having been discriminated against, etc. But the preachers are quite prepared, if necessary, to take advantage of religious ignorance on the part of young Muslims and other grievances as well. And what they do is manipulate individual values and beliefs for radicalisation purposes. None of this is to undermine the importance of the role of the leader within the cell and the importance of trusted peer relationships and kinship to that radicalisation process. But what the evidence does suggest strongly is that the internet and the online materials posted by extremist preachers is now the primary medium by which potential recruits are exposed to the influence of radical events, radical revisionist ideas. The internet is a propaganda, a conduit for propaganda designed to radicalise young Muslims around the world and inspire them to fight jihad at home or abroad. And it was certainly central to the North American case study I've mentioned. But of course it's also, and as has been mentioned this morning, it's been influential in luring young Britons to Syria to fight against the Assad regime. Keep forgetting about this. That was the general factors, yes. Oh, sorry. Yeah. So I just sum up there. Idealists are driven by social external factors. They get their view of the world through perceptions provided by the media, etc. And bottom-up recruitment is key, and that gives the cell leader a lot of influence. Now, callers to Islam. So, callers to Islam, the role of clerics, preachers, to call Muslims to active practice or the faith, or return them to a vow. Most Muslims would agree that this is a commendable factor. The problem lies, or the difficulty lies, is that the extremist preachers I'm talking about are peddling an extreme form of Salafist jihadism. And who are these preachers? They may be erudite and trained scholars and clerics, local imams who are not religiously qualified, international preachers who also may not be religiously qualified, and they particularly have shifted their focus onto online activities. So the focus of what I'm saying now. Primary medium, I've made that point, a conduit for propaganda to urge Muslims to fight jihad at home or abroad. Some of the extremist preachers I've been talking about, you'll recognise these: Abu Musab al-Suri, a sort of pen jihadist, an ideologue who I'll have something more to say about later on, Anas al-Libi, Abu Qatada al-Fistini, and Abu Hamza al-Mazri, the famous hook-hander, and Omar Bakri Muhammad. The last of them is still quite a firebrand and a pain. This is a quote by, attributed to Al-Anwar al-Awlaki. Isn't it ironic that the two capitals of the war against Islam, Washington and Seattle, have also become among the centres of Western jihad? So he was really saying there, as preachers, in terms of our radicalisation efforts, despite everything the Americans and the Europeans have done, now London and Washington are the centres of radicalisation for jihad. So I think we can say that the internet has become what we might call a virtual headquarters of jihad. It's the first web-based militant movement, and of course as such, and again as Martin says, it's given Al-Qaeda a global reach that it's never had hitherto, nor previous militant jihadist movements that have arisen periodically over the centuries. They haven't had it either. Al-Suri, as I mentioned, doing an analysis of why it is only now that militant jihadism seems to be getting a firm footing, is because in the past, he said, we failed, or our predecessors failed to take with us the Muslim Ummah. We failed to win their support. And why is that? Because they didn't have the communication means available today to Al-Qaeda. It's a very powerful tool, and it supports Al-Qaeda's political and religious doctrine of communicating the concept of global jihad and attracting a wide and continued flow of fighters for the cause. Apart from the longevity of militant jihadism, it depends on appealing to this expanding pool of activists, as well as passive supporters too, because they feed through, or the hope is that they can be fed through. I won't stop to make the point in any detail, but of course the fighters that have gone to Syria and elsewhere are using the media themselves without necessarily having a leader encouraging them to do this, to use advances in internet, information and communications technology to send back messages to people at home to say, you should come and join us. This is the experience we have at the battlefront. This is exciting. This gives us a meaning to life, a purpose. And this is one of the quotes, leave the gangster life behind and join the life of jihad. That's again particularly true for those two middle groups, former drug addicts or criminals who are looking for some purpose in life, looking to atone perhaps, putting the past behind them and moving forward. Messages like these are encouraging. Or the seeker who's really got an existential question mark. Why am I here? What am I here for? What should I do? And they're looking for structure. Right, I've got 1 minute left. We're all suffering from this problem. So I just wanted to make that point. So then I'll go on. Key aspects of the online development, as Martin again mentioned, a wider access to radical interpretations of Islam. Interactive sites allow individuals to find each other. It's like dating sites. And jihadist preachers to identify the committed. The jihadist preachers go online as a means of an after-sales service in a way. They can see what's happening, they watch the communications, this person's committed or particularly vulnerable, he can be groomed, whatever. Outsourcing propaganda production, Inspire magazine, again we've had mentioned that. And then jihadist preachers as mediators of Al-Qaeda's doctrine. We know that Muslims in the diaspora, on the whole, tend not to speak Arabic. They are dependent on these preachers to translate the Quran and Hadith, to translate it and interpret it for people who can't read it in the original. And of course, they can then give a spin on it, the spin that they want. Yeah. Again, the more websites, the better it is for us. We must make the internet our tool. That was posted on azam.com as long ago as 2002. And Al-Awlaki said this: Arabic is the international language of jihad. Most of the jihad literature is available only in Arabic, and publishers are not willing to take the risk of translating it. The only ones who are spending the money and time translating jihadi literature are the Western Intelligence Service. And too bad they would not be willing to share it with you. And so the preachers are doing that, as I say, with their own spin. Just to remind, the 5 constants of jihad, this is Awlaki. Jihad will continue till the day of judgment, does not depend on any individual. This is particularly important after Osama bin Laden was killed. Not territorial in its geographic scope, so it's global, it can start anywhere. Not determined the outcome of any one particular battle, but a relentless ongoing, so a setback here, never mind, move on, we'll win the battle eventually. Victory is not limited to military victory, it culminates in the total definitive supremacy of Islam. Got a quick sprint through there. Al-Awlaki himself was an interesting character. He was born in the USA, largely educated in the USA, not qualified religiously, but very, as most of these preachers are, has tremendous conviction and the ability to portray it, not willing to brook any argument or any other interpretation but his own. So he provides certainty for people looking for certainty. And we really heard that in listening to the online materials. He himself spent years in jail in Yemen, reading and studying the works of Sheikh Yusuf al-Uyari. That sheikh died in 2003 in Yemen. But the real point is, I think, that Awlaki was a major influence in radicalisation. His materials are still being accessed today and very powerful. Thank you very much for listening.